In a small, quiet town on the outskirts of Austin, Texas, there was a diner that had seen better days. The paint on its walls was peeling, the neon sign outside flickered intermittently, and the vinyl seats in the booths were cracked with age. But despite its worn appearance, the diner held a certain charm, a comforting familiarity that drew locals and travelers alike. It wasn't fancy or modern, but it was warm, much like the woman who worked there. Margaret was her name, though. Most people simply called her the Waitress. She was in her late 60s with silver hair tied neatly into a bun and hands that moved steadily, if not quickly, as she carried plates of food to tables. What set Margaret apart from other waitresses, however, were the scars that covered parts of her face and arms. They weren't fresh wounds, they were faded marks etched deeply into her skin, telling stories only she seemed to remember. Some were long and jagged, while others formed circular patterns, almost like burns. To those who didn't know her well, the scars made her look intimidating, or worse, pitiable. Most customers at the diner treated Margaret kindly enough, exchanging pleasantries when she brought their coffee or refilled their glasses. But kindness wasn't universal. There were always a few who couldn't resist making snide remarks under their breath. One afternoon, a group of young men entered the diner, loud and boisterous, laughing over some private joke. They took a table near the window, their energy filling the room. Margaret approached them with her usual calm demeanor, pen and notepad ready in hand. "What can I get you boys today?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. The leader of the group, a tall guy with a baseball cap turned backward, smirked. "Well, ain't you a sight for sore eyes," he said, leaning back in his chair. His friends erupted in laughter, nudging each other as they stared openly at Margaret's scars. "What happened to you, huh? Run into a blender?" Margaret didn't flinch. She'd heard worse comments before, though none of them ever truly rolled off her back. Still, she forced a polite smile. "Just old war wounds," she replied evenly, her tone neither defensive nor bitter. "Now, what would you like to order?" The young man chuckled again, clearly amused by his own cleverness. "War wounds, huh? Must have been one heck of a fight." More laughter followed, and Margaret simply nodded, jotting down their orders without another word. She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving the group to continue their mockery. At the far end of the diner, unnoticed by most, sat a man who watched the entire exchange with growing interest. He was rugged yet refined, his presence commanding, even as he tried to blend in. This was Chuck Norris, the legendary martial artist and actor, known worldwide for his toughness and charisma. Today, though, he wasn't here for publicity or fanfare. He was just another traveler stopping by for a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. Chuck had visited this diner many times before during his road trips. He liked its simplicity and appreciated the friendly atmosphere. Over the years, he'd grown fond of Margaret, admiring her quiet efficiency and the way she handled difficult customers with grace. But today, something about the interaction between Margaret and the rowdy group struck him differently. As the young men continued to mock her, Chuck felt a pang of anger and curiosity. Who was this woman with the scars? And why did she seem so unfazed by the cruelty directed at her? When Margaret returned to refill his coffee, Chuck decided to ask. "Those scars," he began gently, nodding toward her hands. "They look like they've been earned through something extraordinary." Margaret paused mid-pour, surprised by the question. No one had ever asked her about her scars so directly. Not here, anyway. For a moment, she considered brushing him off with a vague answer, the way she usually did. But there was something sincere in Chuck's gaze, something that made her hesitate. "Just old wounds, sir," she finally said, her voice soft. "Nothing special." Chuck raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Nothing special? Looks to me like they're anything but ordinary." Margaret offered a faint smile, avoiding eye contact. "It's all in the past now. Water under the bridge." Her response left Chuck wanting to know more. After finishing his meal and paying his bill, he approached the diner's owner, a grizzled man named Joe, who had run the place for decades. "Joe," Chuck said casually, "tell me about Margaret. What's her story?" Joe sighed, glancing toward the kitchen where Margaret was cleaning up. "She doesn't talk about it much," he admitted. But let's just say she's got more grit than anyone I've ever met. Those scars? They're from saving lives. Real hero stuff. Chuck leaned forward, intrigued. Saving lives? Joe nodded, lowering his voice. Yeah. Turns out our Margaret used to be Maggie Sullivan, a soldier. Army Rangers, no less. Did multiple tours overseas. Got hurt real bad during a mission, shielded her team from an explosion. Earned medals for bravery, but you'd never know it talking to her. She came here after retiring, wanted to live quietly. Never brags about what she did. Chuck listened intently, his respect for Margaret deepening with every word. Here was a woman who had sacrificed everything, for her country, for her comrades, and yet she chose to live humbly, serving others without expecting recognition. It was a level of selflessness he rarely encountered. As he stepped out of the diner that day, Chuck knew one thing for certain. Margaret's story deserved to be told. Not for fame or glory, but because the world needed reminders of true courage, and Margaret embodied that in ways few could imagine. Chuck Norris wasn't the kind of man who sought attention for himself. Over the years, he had built a reputation not just as an action star, but as someone who genuinely cared about people, especially those who served their country. His own family history was steeped in military service. His father had been a World War II veteran, and Chuck himself had once served in the Air Force. He understood sacrifice, duty, and the weight of scars, both visible and invisible, that soldiers carried long after their battles ended. But today, sitting in that humble diner on the outskirts of Austin, Chuck found himself unable to shake off what he'd learned about Margaret. Her quiet dignity, her refusal to retaliate against, the rude young men, and now the revelation of her past. It all painted a picture of someone extraordinary. Yet here she was, living a life so ordinary that most people dismissed her without a second thought. Something about that didn't sit right with him. The next morning, Chuck returned to the diner earlier than usual, parking his truck in the same spot as always. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light across the dusty parking lot. Inside, the diner was quiet, save for the faint sizzle of bacon on the grill and the rhythmic clinking of dishes being stacked. Margaret was already there, moving methodically between tables, wiping down surfaces with a damp cloth. She glanced up when she saw Chuck walk in, offering him a small smile before returning to her task. "Morning," she greeted him as he slid into his usual booth near the window. "Coffee?" "Please," Chuck replied, watching her closely. When she returned with a steaming mug and placed it on the table, he decided to broach the subject again. This time, he wanted to make sure she knew he wasn't prying out of idle curiosity. "Margaret," he began, his voice calm but earnest, "I asked around yesterday about your scars." Her hand froze mid-pour, and for a brief moment she looked startled. Then, as if steeling herself, she set the coffee pot down and straightened up. "Oh?" she said softly, her tone neutral. "And what did you find out?" Chuck hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Enough to know that you're not just another waitress. You've done things most people can't even imagine. Sacrifices I doubt many would have the strength to make." Margaret's expression remained unreadable, though her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the coffee pot. After a pause, she let out a soft sigh. "That was a long time ago, Mr. Norris. It doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to me," Chuck countered gently. "And it should matter to everyone else too. What you did, you saved lives. That's not something you just brush aside." She shook her head, avoiding his gaze. "It wasn't about glory or recognition. I did what needed to be done, and then I came home. End of story." Chuck leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Maybe for you. But do you realize how inspiring your story could be? There are people out there, veterans, civilians, kids, who need to hear about someone like you, someone who gave everything and still chooses to serve others every single day." Margaret frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "I don't want attention," she said firmly. "I never have. All I want is to live my life quietly and help where I can. That's enough for me." Chuck nodded, understanding her reluctance. He had met plenty of veterans who felt the same way, proud of their service but wary of being put on a pedestal. Still, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Margaret's story deserved more than silence. "I get it," he said after a moment. "You've earned the right to keep your peace. But sometimes stories like yours remind us of what real courage looks like. They remind us that heroes aren't just characters in movies. They're real people, walking among us, doing the best they can." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned away, busying herself with refilling salt shakers and rearranging napkin dispensers. Chuck watched her silently, giving her space to think. He knew he couldn't push too hard, not yet. If she was going to share her story, it had to come from her, not because someone pressured her into it. As the morning wore on, the diner began filling up with customers. Margaret moved efficiently from table to table, her demeanor as calm and composed as ever. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like their earlier conversation hadn't affected her at all. But Chuck noticed the subtle changes, the way her movements were slightly slower, her smiles a fraction less bright. Whatever memories he had stirred, they weighed heavily on her. Later that afternoon, after the lunch rush had died down and the diner was nearly empty, Chuck approached her again. She was standing by the counter, flipping through a worn notebook filled with orders. He cleared his throat to get her attention. "Look," he said, keeping his voice low. "I'm not trying to upset you. I think the world needs to hear your story, not for you but for everyone else. People need to see examples of true bravery, especially in times like these." Margaret closed the notebook slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time since their earlier talk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally she sighed. "You really believe that, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do," Chuck replied without hesitation. "But it's your call. If you say no, I'll respect that. Completely." She looked away, staring out the window at the empty parking lot beyond. The scars on her hands caught the sunlight, their jagged lines telling silent tales of fire, smoke, and chaos. Chuck waited patiently, sensing that she was wrestling with a decision far bigger than either of them realized. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret turned back to him. Her expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of resolve in her eyes. "If you think it'll make a difference," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "then maybe it's time." Chuck felt a surge of admiration and relief. He hadn't expected her to agree so quickly, if at all. But he also knew this wasn't the end of the journey. Sharing her story would mean revisiting painful memories, confronting emotions she had kept buried for decades. It wouldn't be easy for either of them. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with gratitude. "You won't regret this, Margaret. I promise." She managed a small, uncertain smile. "We'll see." For the rest of the day, Margaret went about her work as usual, serving meals and refilling drinks with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her for years. But something had shifted, not just in her but in the air around her. It was as if a door had been cracked open, letting in a sliver of light after years of darkness. And though neither of them knew exactly what lay ahead, one thing was certain. Margaret's story was about to change lives, including her own. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation, though Margaret didn't realize it at first. Chuck Norris wasn't the type to waste time once he'd made up his mind, and after Margaret's tentative agreement, he immediately began orchestrating a plan to share her story with the world. But he knew this had to be done carefully, respectfully. Margaret wasn't just another subject for a feel-good news segment. She was a person who had carried unimaginable burdens in silence for decades. Chuck wanted to ensure that whatever happened next honored her bravery and gave her control over how much of herself she revealed. At first, Margaret seemed hesitant to dive into the process. She continued working her shifts at the diner as if nothing unusual was happening, serving customers with the same quiet efficiency she always had. But there were subtle signs that something was brewing beneath the surface. She spent more time than usual lost in thought, staring out the window during slow moments or absent-mindedly tracing the scars on her hands when she thought no one was looking. Occasionally, she'd glance toward Chuck, who had taken to visiting the diner nearly every day now, sitting quietly in his corner booth while jotting notes in a small notebook. He never pressured her, but his presence alone reminded her that change was coming, and it terrified her as much as it intrigued her. One afternoon, after most of the lunch crowd had cleared out, Chuck approached her again. "Margaret," he said gently, "I've been thinking about how we should do this. I don't want anything flashy or overwhelming, just honest. Do you trust me?" She hesitated, clutching the tray of dirty dishes she'd been carrying. "I suppose I do," she admitted after a pause. "But I don't know what this even looks like." Chuck smiled reassuringly. "Let's start small. A local reporter, maybe someone from the community newspaper, someone who understands respect and privacy. We'll keep it simple, a conversation, not an interrogation. You tell them what you're comfortable sharing, and we take it from there." Margaret nodded slowly, though her unease was evident. "And if I say too much? Or not enough? You decide every step of the way." Chuck promised. "If you want to stop, we stop. No questions asked." That night, Chuck reached out to a trusted journalist named Sarah Collins, whose work he admired for its sensitivity and depth. They met at a nearby cafe to discuss the idea, and by the end of their conversation, Sarah was visibly moved. "This could mean so much to people," she said earnestly. "Not just veterans, but anyone who's ever felt invisible or overlooked. If Margaret is willing, I'd be honored to help." With Sarah on board, Chuck returned to the diner the next morning to update Margaret. "We've got someone lined up," he told her. "Sarah's great, kind, professional, and good at letting people speak without pushing. She'll come here tomorrow if that works for you." Margaret swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the coffee pot she held. "Tomorrow?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't have to be tomorrow," Chuck assured her quickly. "We can wait as long as you need." "No," Margaret said after a moment, surprising even herself. "Let's do it. Waiting will only make it harder." The next day, Sarah arrived at the diner shortly before noon. She was younger than Margaret had expected, with warm brown eyes and an easy smile that immediately put people at ease. Chuck introduced them briefly, then excused himself, leaving the two women alone at a corner table. For a while, they simply talked about the weather, about the diner's history, about anything except the reason Sarah was there. Slowly, Margaret began to relax, realizing that Sarah wasn't there to pry or sensationalize. She genuinely wanted to listen. Finally, Sarah broached the topic gently. "Margaret," she began, "I know this might be difficult, but would you mind telling me about your service? About what led you to where you are today?" Margaret stared down at her hands, the scars crisscrossing her skin like road maps of a life lived fully and painfully. For years, she had buried these memories deep inside, afraid of reopening old wounds. But now, sitting across from someone who seemed genuinely interested, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of respect, she found herself wanting to share. "I joined the Army Rangers because I wanted to serve," she began haltingly, her voice soft but steady. "It wasn't easy being a woman in that world back then, but I didn't care. I wanted to prove myself, to show that I could carry my weight. And I did. For a while." Her words came slowly at first, like water trickling through cracks in a dam. But as she spoke, the floodgates opened and the story poured out. She recounted her deployments overseas, the camaraderie and chaos of military life, and the fateful mission that changed everything. "It was supposed to be routine," she explained, her gaze distant, as if reliving the moment. "We were clearing a building when insurgents attacked. There was an explosion. I don't remember much after that, except throwing myself over my team to shield them. When I woke up in the hospital weeks later, I was told I'd saved 5 lives that day. But I also lost part of myself, my body and my face." She gestured vaguely to her scars. "They'll never look the same." Sarah listened intently, tears glistening in her eyes. "What you did, it's incredible, truly heroic." Margaret shook her head, her expression pained. I didn't do it for medals or recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And when I came home, I chose this life because it felt normal, quiet, safe. By the time their conversation ended, both women were emotional, but in different ways. For Margaret, it was cathartic, as though speaking aloud had lifted some invisible weight she'd been carrying for years. For Sarah, it was humbling, a reminder of the extraordinary courage hidden within ordinary lives. Afterward, Chuck joined them, sensing the gravity of what had transpired. "How did it go?" he asked cautiously. Margaret managed a shaky smile. "Better than I thought it would," she admitted. Maybe this is okay." Over the next few days, Sarah worked tirelessly to craft an article that captured Margaret's essence without exploiting her pain. Meanwhile, Chuck helped prepare the diner for what was to come. Word spread quickly among locals that something big was happening, and anticipation buzzed in the air. Though Margaret tried to focus on her work, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of nervous excitement around her. On the day the article was set to publish, Chuck invited Margaret to sit with him in the diner's corner booth. Together they watched as patrons picked up copies of the paper, their eyes widening as they read. At first there was silence, then murmurs, followed by applause. One by one, customers approached Margaret, shaking her hand, thanking her, and offering hugs. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the impact her story was having, not just on others but on herself. For the first time in years, Margaret Sullivan didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, and not just for her scars, but for the strength, sacrifice, and humanity behind them. The day after the article about Margaret was published, the diner became a place of pilgrimage. People from all over town, and even neighboring areas, flocked to see the woman whose story had touched so many hearts. The parking lot was packed with cars, and inside every seat was taken. Strangers mingled with regulars, exchanging whispers of admiration as they waited for their turn to meet Margaret. Some brought flowers, others carried notes of gratitude. It was unlike anything the little diner had ever seen. Margaret herself was overwhelmed by the sudden attention. She moved through the crowded space with her usual quiet efficiency, though her hands trembled slightly as she served plates of food and refilled coffee cups. Every few minutes, someone would stop her to shake her hand or thank her for her service. "You're a hero," one man said earnestly, his voice cracking with emotion. A young mother held her child's hand tightly as she told Margaret, "I want my son to grow up knowing what real bravery looks like." Chuck Norris stayed close by, keeping a watchful eye on Margaret. He could see how the flood of emotions was affecting her. Joy, pride, vulnerability, and even fear, all rolled into one. When the crowd grew too intense, he stepped in, gently, guiding people away to give her breathing room. "Let's not overwhelm her," he reminded them with a firm but kind smile. "She's still just doing her job." Despite the chaos, there were moments that stood out vividly. One elderly veteran approached Margaret, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I served too," he said hoarsely, gripping her hand tightly. "But I never did anything half as brave as you. Thank you for everything." Margaret blinked back her own tears, squeezing his hand in return. "We all do our part," she murmured softly, her voice trembling. That's all it was. Another poignant moment came when the group of young men who had mocked her days earlier walked into the diner. Their entrance caused a hush to fall over the room, and all eyes turned toward them. They looked nervous, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of everyone's stares. The leader of the group, the same tall guy with the backward baseball cap, approached. Margaret hesitantly, his head bowed in shame. "Ma'am," he began, his voice barely audible, We didn't know. About you. About what you've done. We were stupid and cruel, and we're sorry. Really sorry." For a moment, Margaret simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. "It's okay," she said quietly. "You didn't know. No harm done." The young man looked stunned, glancing at his friends before turning back to her. "Can we make it up to you somehow?" "Anything?" Margaret smiled faintly, her scars catching the light as she tilted her head. Just be kinder next time. She replied. To everyone. You don't always know what battles people are fighting. The sincerity in her words struck a chord with the young men, and they left the diner visibly humbled. Watching this exchange, Chuck couldn't help but feel proud, not just of Margaret's grace, but of the way she inspired change in others. Her ability to forgive wasn't just admirable, it was transformative. As the days passed, Margaret's story continued to spread far beyond the confines of the small Texas town. Local news outlets picked up the article, and soon national media followed suit. Social media platforms buzzed with posts about the scarred heroine of Austin, as some had dubbed her. Veterans organizations reached out to honor her publicly, inviting her to speak at events and ceremonies. Even celebrities chimed in, praising her courage and humility. Through it all, Margaret remained grounded. She declined most invitations, preferring to stay close to the life she had built for herself. But Chuck convinced her to accept one, a gala honoring wounded warriors hosted by a prominent Veterans Foundation. This is your chance to inspire even more people, he told her gently. Not just veterans, but civilians too. People need to hear your message. Reluctantly, Margaret agreed. On the night of the event, she stood nervously backstage, clutching a piece of paper with hastily scribbled notes. Chuck, dressed in a sharp suit, stood beside her, offering words of encouragement. You've got this, he assured her. Just speak from the heart. That's all anyone wants. When Margaret finally stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned to her, and for a moment she felt paralyzed by the weight of their gaze. But then she spotted Chuck sitting near the front, giving her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. I never thought I'd be standing here tonight, she admitted, her voice steady despite her nerves. For years, I kept my past hidden because I didn't think anyone would care. Or worse, because I was afraid of being judged. But I've learned something important these past few weeks. Our scars aren't weaknesses. They're reminders of where we've been and how far we've come. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Many were veterans, their own scars visible or hidden beneath layers of resilience. Others were family members, supporters, and allies who had come to show their solidarity. Margaret's words resonated deeply with each of them. When I was injured overseas, she continued, I thought my life was over. I thought no one would see me as anything more than my wounds. But I realized something. It's not about the scars we carry. It's about the love we give despite them. Every time I serve someone a meal, every time I offer a smile or a kind word, I'm choosing to live beyond my pain. And that's something we can all do, no matter what battles we're fighting. By the time she finished speaking, the entire room was on its feet, erupting into thunderous applause. Tears streamed down faces, and several attendees rushed to hug her as she stepped off the stage. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly understood. Not as a victim of circumstance, but as a symbol of hope and perseverance. Back at the diner the next morning, life slowly returned to normal. The crowds thinned out, and the usual rhythm of breakfast orders and lunch rushes resumed. But something had changed forever. The patrons treated Margaret with newfound respect, calling her by name and thanking her whenever she served them. Even the staff seemed invigorated, inspired by her example of quiet strength. Chuck visited often, checking in on her and sharing updates about the ripple effect of her story. Letters poured in from across the country, written by strangers who had been moved to tears, or action, by her words. Some vowed to volunteer with veterans groups, others promised to be kinder in their daily lives. Margaret read each letter carefully, marveling at the power of a single story to spark change. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast a warm glow over the diner, Chuck joined Margaret at a corner table. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the last few customers leave. Finally, Chuck broke the quiet. You know, he said, a thoughtful look in his eyes. You've done something extraordinary. Not just by sharing your story, but by showing people that true heroes aren't defined by medals or fame. They're defined by the choices they make every day to keep going, to keep giving, to keep loving. Margaret smiled, her scars illuminated softly by the fading light. "I didn't do it alone," she replied. "You helped me see that my story mattered. And maybe it does." Chuck grinned, raising his coffee mug in a mock toast. "To ordinary people doing extraordinary things." Margaret laughed softly, clinking her mug against his. "To that." In that moment, surrounded by the comforting familiarity of the diner she called home, Margaret knew she had found her purpose, not in fame or accolades, but in the simple act of reminding others that everyone has a story worth telling. And sometimes those stories have the power to heal, inspire, and unite us all. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret's life settled into a new rhythm. The initial whirlwind of attention had died down, but its impact lingered in profound ways. The diner became more than just a place to grab a meal. It transformed into a sanctuary for veterans and their families. Word spread quickly among the military community that this was a safe space, a haven where they could share stories, find comfort, and connect with someone who truly understood their struggles. People began referring to it as Margaret's Diner, even though the sign outside still bore its original name. Everyday strangers walked through the door seeking not just food but solace. Some were retired soldiers dealing with the invisible wounds of war, PTSD, survivor's guilt, or the ache of feeling forgotten by society. Others were active duty personnel on leave, looking for a taste of home-cooked kindness. And then there were the families, the spouses, children, and parents of those who had served, each carrying their own burdens of worry, loss, or pride. To all of them, Margaret extended the same warmth and compassion she always had, treating each visitor like an old friend. One chilly autumn morning, a young woman named Emily entered the diner with her 2 small children in tow. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Margaret immediately noticed her distress and approached the table with a gentle smile. "Morning, darling," she said softly. "What can I get you?" Emily hesitated, glancing at her kids before answering. "Just coffee, please. And maybe some pancakes for the little ones." Margaret nodded and went to fetch their order, but something about Emily stayed with her. When she returned with the food, she lingered at the table, sensing the weight of unspoken pain. After a moment, she asked gently, "You okay, sweetheart? You look like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, and she shook her head. "My husband, he didn't come back from his last deployment," she confessed, her voice breaking. "It's been 6 months, but it feels like yesterday." Margaret's heart ached for the young widow. Without hesitation, she pulled out a chair and sat down beside her. For the next hour, she listened as Emily poured out her grief, the sleepless nights, the overwhelming responsibility of raising her kids alone, the constant fear that her husband's sacrifice would be forgotten. Margaret didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, she simply listened, nodding occasionally and offering quiet words of understanding. When Emily finally ran out of tears, Margaret reached across the table and took her hand. "You're stronger than you think," she said firmly. "And your husband, he gave everything so you and your babies could have a future. Don't ever forget that. But also don't forget that you're not alone. There are people here who care about you. Me, for one." By the time Emily left the diner later that afternoon, she seemed lighter, as if sharing her burden had eased it slightly. From that day forward, she became a regular, bringing her kids every Saturday morning for breakfast. Margaret made sure to check in on her each time, asking how she was doing and reminding her that she had a support system, even if it was just one scarred waitress in a tiny Texas diner. Chuck Norris continued to play a pivotal role in Margaret's journey, using his influence to amplify her message of resilience and compassion. Together, they founded a foundation called Scars of Service, dedicated to supporting wounded warriors transitioning to civilian life. The organization provided resources ranging from job training programs to mental health counseling, helping veterans rebuild their lives after leaving the military. What set Scars of Service apart was its emphasis on storytelling. Chuck believed deeply in the power of personal narratives to inspire change, and Margaret's story became the cornerstone of the Foundation's mission. The launch event for Scars of Service took place in a large auditorium in Austin, drawing hundreds of attendees. Veterans, celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens gathered to celebrate the initiative and honor those who had sacrificed so much. Margaret stood nervously, backstage clutching Chuck's arm as she peered out at the sea of faces. "I'm not cut out for this," she whispered, her anxiety palpable. "You are," Chuck replied firmly, squeezing her hand. "Look around. These people are here because of you, because of what you represent." When Margaret stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. This time, she didn't feel paralyzed by the attention. Instead, she felt buoyed by the love and gratitude radiating from the crowd. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. "I used to think my scars made me less," she admitted, gesturing to her face. "Less beautiful, less worthy, less whole. But now I know they make me more. They remind me of the lives I helped save, the battles I fought, not just overseas but within myself. And they remind me that no matter how broken we feel, we can still choose to give love, to serve others, to keep moving forward." Her words resonated deeply, sparking both tears and cheers throughout the auditorium. By the end of the night, donations poured in, ensuring that Scars of Service would have the funding it needed to make a real difference. Back at the diner, life carried on as usual, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret embraced her role as a mentor and confidant, offering guidance to anyone who sought it. She often reminded her visitors that healing wasn't linear, and that it was okay to stumble along the way. "We're all works in progress," she'd say with a smile. "The important thing is to keep going." She also inspired those around her to pay it forward. One evening, a group of high school students volunteered to repaint the diner's exterior, transforming the faded walls into a vibrant mural depicting scenes of unity and courage. Another time, a local business owner donated new furniture to replace the cracked vinyl booths, insisting that heroes deserved comfort too. Even the rowdy young men who had once mocked Margaret returned to the diner, this time with humility and respect. They apologized again, explaining that hearing her story had changed their perspective. "We started volunteering at the VA hospital," one of them admitted sheepishly. "We wanted to do something meaningful, like you've done." Margaret beamed at them, her heart swelling with pride. "That's all I ever wanted, for people to see the good in each other and act on it." As winter approached, the diner hosted its first annual gratitude dinner, an event organized by Chuck and Margaret to honor veterans and their families. Tables were adorned with American flags, and volunteers served hearty meals free of charge. Speeches were given, songs were sung, and laughter echoed through the room late into the night. It was a celebration of resilience, community, and the enduring spirit of service. At the center of it all was Margaret, her scars illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight. She moved between tables, hugging old friends and welcoming new ones, her presence a testament to the idea that true heroism isn't measured by grand gestures, but by the countless small acts of kindness that shape our lives. By the end of the evening, as the last guest departed and the diner fell silent, Margaret stood by the window gazing out at the stars. Chuck joined her, handing her a cup of hot cocoa. "You've touched so many lives," he said quietly, "including mine." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, or without everyone who supported me. This isn't just my story anymore. It belongs to all of us." And in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of gratitude and camaraderie, Margaret knew she had found her calling, not as a waitress or a soldier, but as a beacon of hope for anyone brave enough to keep fighting, no matter the odds. Years passed, and the diner became more than just a landmark. It became a symbol. The once-weathered building now stood as a testament to resilience, its walls adorned with photos, letters, and mementos from veterans and their families who had found solace within its doors. Margaret's story had inspired countless others to share their own journeys, turning the diner into a living archive of courage and sacrifice. Every corner seemed to whisper tales of battles fought, wounds healed, and lives rebuilt. Margaret herself had aged gracefully, her silver hair now fully white and her movements slower but still steady. Yet her spirit remained unbroken, radiating warmth and wisdom that drew people in like moths to a flame. She continued working at the diner, though she no longer handled every shift alone. A group of volunteers, many of them former patrons who had been touched by her kindness, took turns helping out, ensuring that Margaret could rest when needed. But even on her days off, she often stopped by, unable to stay away for long. The diner was her home, and its visitors were her family. Chuck Norris remained a constant presence in Margaret's life, visiting whenever his schedule allowed. Their friendship had deepened over the years, built on mutual respect and shared values. Together, they expanded Scars of Service into a nationwide initiative, opening centers across the country where veterans could access resources, counseling, and community support. Each center bore the same ethos as the original diner, a place where no one felt invisible, where everyone mattered. One crisp spring morning, Chuck arrived at the diner with an unexpected announcement. "Margaret," he said, sliding into his usual booth, "we've been invited to Washington, D.C. next month. They want to honor you, at the Capitol." Margaret nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding. "Honor me? For what?" "For being exactly who you are," Chuck replied with a grin. "They're dedicating a memorial plaque in your name, a tribute to all the unsung heroes like you who have given so much without asking for recognition." Margaret shook her head, overwhelmed by the idea. "I don't need anything like that. All I ever wanted was to help people. And you have," Chuck said firmly. "But this isn't just about you. It's about showing the world that heroes come in all forms, not just the ones we see in movies or read about in history books. You've shown us what true bravery looks like, and it's time the rest of the nation sees it too." Though reluctant at first, Margaret eventually agreed to attend the ceremony. On the day of the event, she stood nervously beside Chuck on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by dignitaries, veterans, and civilians alike. As the crowd cheered and cameras flashed, Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she knew this moment wasn't just for her. It was for everyone whose sacrifices had gone unnoticed. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret stepped up to the podium, gripping the edges tightly as she scanned the sea of faces before her. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but as she began to speak, it grew stronger, filled with emotion. "I never thought I'd stand here today," she admitted, her eyes glistening with tears. "For most of my life, I believed my scars made me less beautiful, less worthy, less whole. But over the years, I've learned something important. They don't define me. My choices do. And I chose to keep serving, to keep giving, because that's what keeps me alive inside." She paused, glancing at Chuck, then back at the audience. "To anyone out there struggling, whether you're a veteran, a caregiver, or just someone trying to find your way, I want you to know this. Your scars don't make you broken. They make you human. And humanity is messy, painful, beautiful, and worth fighting for. So keep going. Keep loving. Keep choosing kindness, even when it's hard. Because every act of love, no matter how small, ripples outward and changes the world." The crowd erupted into applause, many wiping away tears as Margaret stepped down from the podium. That night, as she sat in her hotel room reflecting on the day's events, she realized something profound. Her scars weren't just reminders of pain. They were symbols of hope. Hope that even after the darkest storms, light could break through. Hope that even the smallest acts of kindness could spark monumental change. Back in Texas, the diner buzzed with excitement as locals gathered to celebrate Margaret's return. The gratitude dinner had become an annual tradition, drawing larger crowds each year. This time, however, the event was extra special. A banner hung above the entrance reading, "Welcome home, Margaret, our true American hero." Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Veterans shared stories of triumph and healing, while children ran around laughing, blissfully unaware of the weight of the conversations happening around them. Margaret moved through the room, hugging old friends and meeting new ones, her heart swelling with gratitude. At one point, Chuck took the microphone and addressed the crowd. "This woman has taught me, and all of us, what it means to live with purpose," he said, gesturing toward Margaret. "She's shown us that heroism isn't about fame or glory. It's about choosing to serve others even when no one is watching. It's about finding beauty in imperfection and strength in vulnerability. Margaret, you may not think of yourself as extraordinary, but to us you are. Thank you for reminding us what really matters." As the crowd erupted into cheers, Margaret stepped forward, visibly moved. "I didn't do any of this alone," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room. "Every single person here has played a part in making this community what it is today. We lift each other up, we heal together, and we move forward, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary." Her words lingered in the air long after the dinner ended, echoing in the hearts of everyone who heard them. Over the years, Margaret's legacy continued to grow. The diner remained a beacon of hope, welcoming travelers and locals alike with open arms. And though Margaret eventually retired, passing the reins to a younger generation eager to carry on her mission, her influence endured. On quiet evenings, when the diner was empty except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the floorboards, newcomers would often pause to admire the mural on the wall. Painted by local artists, it depicted Margaret standing beneath a tree, its branches stretching skyward like arms reaching for the stars. Beneath the image, a simple inscription read, "It's not about the scars you carry, it's about the love you give despite them." And so Margaret's story lived on, not just in the memories of those who knew her, but in the countless lives she had touched. Her scars, once a source of shame, had become badges of honor, testaments to the sacrifices made by so many unsung heroes. Through her quiet strength and unwavering compassion, Margaret had reminded the world that true courage lies not in avoiding pain, but in embracing it and rising above it with grace and love.